Good afternoon, dear guests. It is truly a pleasure to see you here today and welcome to our symposium on Christianity and Islam, coexistence, communication, and a shared future. Also, a warm welcome to those of you who are with us through the screen. We are honored to have outstanding speakers with us today. Thank you for being a part of this event, Dr. Steen Skovsgaard, all the way from Denmark. And thank you, Hilal, Muhammed, and Heiðrún Helga for your valuable contribution. I also want to express my gratitude to Stofnun Dr. Sigurbjörns Einarssonar and Kjalarnes Prófastsdæmi for your support. My name is Matthildur Bjarnadóttir. I am a pastor here in Vídalínskirkju, and I have an MA in Religious Studies from the University of Copenhagen. Christian-Muslim relations in Europe over at least the last 1,000 years have been complex, marked by periods of both conflict and cooperation. Icelandic society has become increasingly diverse in recent years as people from various religious and cultural backgrounds have settled in our country, and Muslims have become more visible in our society. One can estimate that the Muslim population here in Iceland is somewhere around 2,000 people. So far, cohabitation between religions in Iceland has been relatively peaceful. But we cannot overlook the fact that many Muslims face prejudice and discrimination. To get a glimpse of that reality, you don't have to look further than the comment section for this very event, where a large group of people felt the need to express their hostility towards Islam and Muslims. While Iceland is generally tolerant, there are segments of the population with negative perceptions of Islam due to global narratives around extremism or conservative interpretations of the religion. Some Icelanders may see Muslim immigrants as a challenge to Icelandic values, such as gender inequality and LGBTQ+ rights. These are important issues to Icelanders who have fought for equal rights in many spheres in society, and the nation overall is quite proud of its progress regarding equality and freedom. Addressing these tension points requires open dialogue, education, and initiatives that promote mutual understanding and respect between Muslim immigrants and the broader Icelandic community. Dialogue between Christians and Muslims can help bridge the gap between these groups and encourage shared participation in society. In a small society like Iceland, social cohesion is quite important, and dialogue strengthens that. Prejudice and discrimination can result in social exclusion and isolation, hate crimes, and negative stereotypes. Disparities in socio-economic status can lead to feelings of resentment and frustration among marginalized Muslim population, contributing to tensions. This fuels mistrust between communities and therefore threatens the peace in our country. Prejudice often thrives when people do not know each other. If Christians and Muslims never engage in dialogue, misconceptions about one another can easily take roots. However, through conversation, questions can be asked, misunderstandings clarified, and false stereotypes corrected. In fact, Christianity and Islam share fundamental values such as human dignity, peace, and respect for life. We both believe in one God, the importance of good deeds, and the focus on moral values. There is a lot that unites us, and at the same time, we also must encompass the courage to discuss what divides us. Muslims and Christians are going to live together in this country. That is a fact. We have a choice in how we are going to live together. Are we going to steer away from each other and foster mistrust and even conflict? Or are we going to engage in an honest and courageous dialogue in order to coexist in peace and also reap the benefits from a diverse community? We don't have to agree on everything to achieve that, but we must talk and get to know each other. A follower of Christ is tasked with loving their neighbor. The National Church of Iceland would not be true to its calling if it wouldn't take part in interfaith dialogue and become a part of the solution. Being a multicultural society is complicated, and it takes work to be a successful, diverse society. The goal of this symposium, and hopefully the conversations that follows, is to increase and preserve peace, goodwill, and well-being. We want a society where people thrive and feel that they have a role and a purpose here in Iceland. If you can work toward that, our nation will become richer in so many ways. We all lose as a nation when individuals within our society wither under adversity and prejudice and are not given the opportunity to become active participants. Being an immigrant is complex, and many need help integrating into society. That requires time, manpower, and money, but it costs us much more not to do it. We have examples throughout history and across the world of societies where the coexistence of Christians and Muslims has been successful, and also where it has gone poorly, sometimes with tragic consequences. Let us strive to be an example of the former. So, without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. Dr. Steen Skovsgaard was a pastor and a bishop in the Danish National Church, and he will discuss the work of the Danish Church in neighborhoods with large immigrant populations in Denmark in his lecture called "What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor?" Hilal Kuchu-Kakan, chairman of the Horizon Association, and Muhammed Emin Kizilkaya, PhD student in sociology at the University of Iceland, are then going to give us an insight into the lived experience of Muslims in Iceland. Finally, Reverend Heiðrún Helga Bjarnadóttir, Bach, MA in Sociology of Religion from the University of Copenhagen, will discuss the topic of refugees and multiculturalism in Iceland. Dr. Steen, welcome. We look forward to hearing your experience.
Thank you very much for the introduction. But before I come to the topic, what can you offer me as a Muslim pastor? Just a short presentation. As it was said, I have been a pastor in Gellerup Church, and this is Gellerup Church that we see here, for 26 years. And then after that, I was a bishop 2005 to 2017 in the Diocese of Lolland-Falster, the southern part of Denmark. And after that, I wrote my PhD thesis, which was completed in 2022. But it was in 1991 to 93, while I was a pastor in Gellerup, that the parish changed dramatically. In these 2 years, many Muslims, mostly Palestinians, settled and took up residence in Gellerup, with the consequence that in this period, the Muslim population doubled, and the Danish National Church became a minority church. Not even 50% of the population in the parish were members of the church, and there were now 60 nationalities. From that time, I've been studying Islam and been involved in dialogue with Muslims in many ways. I've published some books on the topic, Islam and Christianity. The first was in 1994. The Foreigner You Will Always Have With You, it's called. And another book was in 2004, What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor, which is the title for this lecture. And in 2022, I finished my PhD on Judgment Day in Islam and Christianity. My lecture earlier this afternoon was a theological statement of differences and similarities of Christianity and Islam, and I introduced my PhD on Judgment Day in Islam and Christianity. Now, in this lecture, I'll like to tell you more about my own personal experience with meeting Muslims. I'll give you a few examples from these meetings and dialogues, and then tell you about my answer and my problems in answering the question, what can you offer me as a Muslim pastor? And I hope that this can be useful for you and inspire and encourage you to meet and talk to Muslims and to share life, thoughts, and faith with each other. This is the Turkish Imam and the chairman for my local mosque in Brabrand from a dialogue meeting that we had some years ago about Judgment Day. But the first I want to say is, or quote, it's an Arabic proverb or saying which I myself often have used as a reminder for myself. It says, not all fingers are the same, even though they belong to the same hand. Like all of us, Muslims are not all alike. They come from different countries, they have different language, different work and status. They don't think and believe in the same way. They are, in short, different. So this is the first thing we have to know and to remember. This means, secondly, even though that you might know much about Islam and Muslims, you don't know what the specific Muslim you have in front of you thinks, believes, behaves, or feels. He or she is the only one to tell you. I myself have been surprised many times. It has surprised me that many Muslims don't know the Quran. Many don't go to the mosque. Many don't even pray. But a lot of Muslims are fasting and keep the Ramadan. And as you know, we are now in the middle of the Ramadan right now. Muslims have, in general, the same relations to Ramadan as Christmas, as Christians to Christmas. And in a way, we are celebrating the same event, God's words coming to us. Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God, and Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the word of God sent to the world. We celebrate this with a long preparation time and end with a big celebration. Eid for the Muslims and Christmas for the Christians. On the Faroe Island, they have a proverb or saying that I mentioned earlier this day, "Glecht er gestens eie," and I think it's almost as in Iceland. The eyes of the foreigner are clear. The foreigner sees things that you might not be aware of, and on the other way around, you can see things that he is not aware of. You might have something spiritual and cultural that he misses or needs. This is a beautiful encouragement to meet and listen to each other. But in this meeting, you first of all have to be silent and be listening and humble. Maybe you know the Danish Steen Skovsgaard's word about humility in helping and understanding others. He said, all true help begins with humiliation. The helper must first humble himself before those he wants to help, and hereby understand that to help is not to rule, but to serve. Help is willingness to be humble and for a moment to realize that you are wrong and you don't understand what the other understands. I'll give you a few examples. Many years ago, I went to a conference in Copenhagen, and one of the topics were, how do I meet a Muslim? And there was a very competent Norwegian pastor who gave a very good lecture. After the conference, the pastor and I went by taxi to the same hotel, and I took the back seat and he took the front seat next to the driver, who was Arabic looking with black hair, and his Danish was not that good. The pastor started a conversation with the driver, and I was listening to this, what might become a practical lecture. But this didn't go very well because the driver couldn't understand Norwegian. Hvordan det drosje? The driver didn't know the word drosje. When we came to the hotel, the pastor paid the driver and said, "See you another time, inshallah." The driver shook his head. "Don't you greet me in this way," he said. "I'm an Orthodox Christian and not a Muslim." So the Muslim in front of you might be a Christian, and taxi drivers are very often still Christians. By another meeting, I also learned to be more humble. It took place in a bazaar in Turkey. I was looking for t-shirts for my children to bring home some presents, and they were surprisingly cheap, even though it was the most expensive branded products. I asked the first shop assistant, are they real? Nike, Adidas, and whatever the brands were? "Yes, of course," he answered. But I doubted if this was true. And I asked another man, and he said the same. Then I asked a third assistant, and he answered, "No, of course not. It couldn't be so cheap if they were real brands." "Oh, thank you," I said. "I'll buy 4 from you. You see, I'm a Christian, and I don't like when people are lying." And he said to me, "And I don't lie because I'm a Muslim." My very first meeting and religious dialogue with a young Muslim took place in 1993 during my sabbatical. He was so kind and invited me to his home in order to tell me more about Islam and how he was practicing his religion. He showed me where and when and how he prayed, told me about Ramadan and the scriptures, and we were sitting on the floor having a cup of tea. During our conversation, I noticed a picture on the wall. It was a man who was weeping with big tears. He looked like Jesus on the way to Golgotha. I asked him, "Who is that person?" He didn't know, and I studied the picture and saw that it was John the Baptist. I told him, and he answered, "I don't care, but I'm so happy with this picture because it shows my feelings, how I feel inside." I was surprised because he looked so happy, so proud, so integrated, and then he had this wound. I learned an important lesson by this meeting. Not only this young Muslim, but all of us have wounds and are suffering in one or other way. This is it's good to remember in order to understand each other and to be more sympathetic. How and where do we meet? Here it is important that we use our imagination. We have to meet people where they are, and this might not always be where we think they are. The Anglican priest, Christopher Lamb, has told me this little story. One day he was invited to visit an old man who lived in a small house in the countryside. He came at the appointed time and knocked at the door, but no one opened the door. He knocked again, but apparently no one was at home. Then he noticed a spider web on the door and realized that this door was never used. He had to look for another entrance. And quite right. There was an entrance on the other side of the house, and here the man was sitting and waiting for the priest. This little story is a good illustration of how to meet and get in contact with people you don't know, especially if their religion and culture are different from your own. There might be other ways to get in contact than you may think. This was the book, What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor, which I wrote many years ago. But this is an illustration for one of the best and most successful initiatives that we started in Gellerup Church, which was and is called International Evenings. Here, immigrants from the area are invited to join a dinner and fellowship in the church, and there is different program during the evening. Sometimes there are more than 15 to 20 different nationalities together, and here there is a very good opportunity to learn and to be together with other cultures and religions. And first of all, you eat together and get to know each other's food and eating habits. This is certainly an initiative that I can recommend. And this is a cookbook with recipes for foreign foods. If you want to get in contact with Muslims, it's always a good idea to ask for help, like Jesus does in John chapter 3, where he meets the Samaritan woman. Tired as he was from the journey, he sat down by the well, and when the Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me something to drink?" This was the beginning of a long conversation between Jesus and the woman. So, ask for help, and I'm sure you will be surprised to meet such a great hospitality and readiness to help. And now to the title of this lecture from my book, What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor? When I was a pastor in Gellerup Church, in 1995, I was appointed by the bishop as a diocese pastor with reference to Islam and Christianity in the Diocese of Aarhus. Even though that I have studied only a little of Islam and wrote my small book called You Always Have the Foreigners Among You, I was very insecure because what does it mean to be a diocese pastor? And what was actually my task? But I said yes, and soon I found out what the task could be. Because a few months later, a Muslim invited me to a dialogue meeting between a very famous Danish Muslim Imam, Abdul Wahid Petersen, and me. We were supposed to discuss Islam and Christianity. Do you like to join the meeting? I was asked by the Muslim woman who called me. We will be around 100 Muslims from Copenhagen and Aarhus. And honestly, I didn't like or want to go to this meeting. But I said, oh yes, I really do. I'd like to. Thank you for the invitation. The old Professor P.G. Linhart once said at the end of one of his sermons, "It is what you don't want to do that you have to do." He talked about the sense of duty. And I think he's right. So I accepted the invitation, but I was very uncertain. So before the meeting, I invited some Christians from my congregation to join the meeting so that I was not all alone. And they were around 7 or 10 and were sitting on the first row, almost as excited as me. Our dialogue went very well and in good order, and after our discussion, there were questions from the audience. And here, a young Muslim from Copenhagen stood up and said, "I have a question for you, Pastor. What can you offer me as a Muslim?" And now don't you come up with a cheap answer saying dove or something like that. No. What can you offer me? And what was I to answer him? He asked me as a pastor. That means he wanted to know what the gospel or Christianity could mean for a Muslim. And I was not allowed to say love or God's love, which actually would have been a good answer. But this was for him a cheap answer, so what else could I say and offer to a young, self-confident Muslim who raised up such a simple and fundamental question? Luckily, I had 1 or 2 minutes to reflect because he had other things to say to the audience. But finally, he was silent, and I was supposed to give him an answer. And I answered him as follows. I must say that I only have what you call a cheap answer to give you. I can offer you God's grace. And the word grace comes from the Latin word gratia, which means for free. So this is, of course, a cheap answer. That's what I can offer you. I myself consider this to be a very good answer. It was clear, evident, and true, and the Christians whom I had invited to the meeting agreed. They nodded, almost clapping their hands, because they thought this was a perfectly good answer. But when I looked at the Muslims, then they had quite another reaction. They shook their heads, staring at the floor, and it was obviously that this answer was nonsense for all 100 Muslims. What did I mean? How could I give such an answer? Who was I to offer God's grace to every person in the audience? Did I think I was God? And after the evening went on, and the evening went on with other questions. And after the meeting, I couldn't forget this dialogue and the impression of the Muslims who couldn't or wouldn't understand or accept my answer. Whereas the Christians were quite satisfied with the answer, the Muslims were, I don't know, maybe offended. But what was wrong with my answer? It was obviously not a good answer. So could I have answered him in a better way? Well, I think so. After some days or weeks of reflection, I reached the conclusion that another answer could have been better, or at least more challenging. I could have given him this answer instead. I'm sorry to disappoint you, because I don't think I have anything to offer you. For me, it seems that you are satisfied and content with Islam. You give the impression that you're rich in your faith. Your hands are full of Islam. Therefore, I cannot offer you anything. Christianity and the gospel are for the poor, for the hungry, for the thirsty, for the empty-handed, those who have discovered themselves as insufficient and not in the position to do God's will. The gospel is for sinners. This is the persons that the gospel is basically intended for, and for whom Jesus lived and died. And I don't have the impression, I could say to him, that this is how you look at yourself. But listen to me, if you one day will come to the conclusion or realize that you are insufficient and haven't done enough in relation to God or to other people, or you doubt whether God loves you or wants to have anything to do with you, or if you are afraid of the judgment day, on that day you must promise me to come back, because then I have something to offer you. Until then, you must be content or satisfied with Islam. This response would indeed have been more challenging and thought-provoking. If I had given him this answer, he and the audience most likely would have felt both hit and provoked. He might even have been shocked or offended. Every reaction would have been better, much better, than this indifference that I met from the audience. So why was my answer wrong? I offered him the cheap grace. The cheap grace, which is, according to Bonhoeffer, grace without repentance. He calls it justification of sin without justification of the sinner. Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. It's not a gift of God. Cheap grace is baptism without church discipline. It's communion without confession. It's grace without the cross. In short, cheap grace, according to Bonhoeffer, is simply grace without Jesus, and grace without Jesus is no grace at all. This is what I learned from this meeting, and which is a topic I deal with in my book. I also want to share another experience with you. Many years ago, we were a group from the church who wanted to make a religious, sociological investigation of the inhabitants in Gellerup. We wanted to know more about their thinking, way of living, faith, and so on. We therefore made an inquiry form and presented it first to a sociologist. Your inquiry form is all right, he said, but you need one more question. That is, how important is God to you? And then you make a scale from 1 to 10 where people can choose a number. Then you can, in a way, take the temperature of people's faith. We agreed and made the inquiry form, as he said. But before we went out asking people all these questions, we had a meeting where we tried to interview each other. There were also some Muslims who took part in the interview group, and I was sitting next to a Muslim woman and asked her all the questions. Then I came to the question, how important is God to you? From 1 to 10, which number will you choose? She said 10. Loud and clear and quick. I wrote 10. Then she was the one to ask me. And she came to the question, how important is God to you? Which number will you choose? I was silent. I didn't actually know what to say. After a while, I very silent said, 10. I was thinking, when she was able to say 10, then I can do the same. After all, I'm a pastor. But I had at the same time and afterwards an unpleasant feeling. I felt that I had been lying. And I wondered, what is wrong? The next weeks, I made more than 30 interviews, and my experience was loud and clear. The Muslims said 10. Yes, most of them said, God is greater than 10. Find an endless number. God is greater than my life, said even Muslims who had beers and wine on the table and smoked cigarettes. But when I came to the Danish, or the Christians, they were all much more uncertain. They didn't know what to say, or most of them said, make it 5. Or 5.5 was one of the most precisely answer I got. And after this experience, I thought, why is it so? Is it so that all Muslims are very strong believers and the Christians are tepid or lukewarm? Are Christians and me all weak in our faith? Or what was wrong? My answer is no. I don't think so. Maybe because I had the same feeling. But I think this shows one of the differences between Islam and Christianity. And it says, in my opinion, something very important about Christianity. Jesus was once asked, "Which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And he replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it." The second is the same. It's on the same level. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. That means you are, as a Christian, not allowed valuing God more highly than your neighbor. There must be a balance. God and your neighbor. So if Christians become uncertain and are uncomfortable by saying that God means everything, I find the reason in the Christian faith and in the teaching of Jesus Christ. Never value God more highly than your neighbor. This is a strain which all Christians lives. Your faith never allows you to neglect or suppress human beings in the name of God. God is not greater than my neighbor. In the so-called Sermon on the Mount, Jesus even says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar and first go and be reconciled with your brother. Then come and offer your gift. In the same chapter from Matthew, Jesus says, you have heard that it is said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. How is that possible, you may say? This is the last thing I want to say, and which I also find very important to this topic. How is it possible to fulfill the will of God? And what is actually the will of God? I once had a public meeting in Gellerup with a very well-known pastor and Islamic expert, Colin Chapman. And one of the Muslims asked him, do you in your Christian faith have a similar word or conception as jihad? That means struggle. And the answer was no. We don't have to struggle for the fulfillment of the will of God. We don't have to struggle for the love of God or to please God, because God has already struggled for us. He has given us his love, and the only thing we have to do is to receive his love, like a mirror. The only thing we have to do is to reflect God's love in our daily life. Soon, coming to the end of my lecture, I'll share one more thought-provoking experience which took place many years ago while I was a pastor in Gellerup. I was going to a baptismal visit to talk to a mother who was about to have her child baptized. When I arrived, I noticed that I had been here a few years before. And I also remembered the conversation I had had with the mother. And it hadn't been a very good conversation, because when I encouraged the mother to bring up her child in the Christian faith and say the Lord's Prayer with her child, she said she had just yawned and asked if I wanted to have more coffee. And now she was going to have her second child baptized. So I took the liberty of asking her, how is the baptismal training with your first child going? She smiled and said, I admit that when you were here for the first time and talked about it, I thought that I probably wouldn't do much about bringing up my child in the Christian faith. But I tell you what happened to me for 6 months ago. My girl came from kindergarten and showed me a drawing that she had made there. See a beautiful church that I have painted, she said. But this wasn't a church, it was a mosque. This is a mosque, I said, the mother said. And her girl asked, what's the difference? The Muslim children had painted mosques And when she did the same, they had told her, yours is a church because you are a Christian, and ours are mosques. And the mother said to me, after this episode, I have decided to read the Bible and pray the Lord's Prayer with my children. I've realized that I have to do something for bringing up my children in the Christian faith, or else they will become Muslims, and I don't want my children to be Muslim. In this way, it can be said that Islam is not only a challenge, but a gift to an old and stiffened or lukewarm Christianity. As my last word, I'll quote an Austrian-British philosopher, Karl Popper. He's very much concerned with tolerance and has the concept he calls the tolerance paradox, which reads, unlimited tolerance leads to intolerance. If tolerance is unlimited, then you can be sure that intolerance will prevail. Therefore, he writes, it is important to set limits for tolerance. And what does this mean for a multicultural and multi-religious society? This means that we must protect the minorities, but we must not let them decide over the majority. Consideration and tolerance goes both ways. I have a definition of tolerance that I'm very happy about. According to the New Danish Dictionary, there are two different definitions of tolerance. The first is to be patient or open-minded for those who think differently. The other is tolerance as the maximum allowed distance between two machine parts. This is tolerance. In this case, tolerance means a distance, but a maximum allowed distance. Especially this definition I like very much, tolerance as distance. We should not try to pressure or change each other. We must respect the distance, but this must not be too large. If it gets too large, we risk hurting each other. And if it gets too small, it will also affect both of us negatively. So living together with different religions and cultures is not easy. It is a challenge. It might be difficult and painful, but let us remember God's word in the Bible. Love the foreigner. Take care of him or she. And above all, meet them. Talk to them and listen to them. Let's boldly share life and faith with each other, also with the foreigners. We have something to offer to each other. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Steen. You gave us a lot of food for thought. I would like to welcome Hilal to the stage. Yes, sure, yeah, of course.
So it's actually Ramadan, but I'm not fasting because I'm pregnant. Yeah, thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have my notes. Yes, so my name is Hilal. I am 30 years old. I'm a teacher and have been since 2018. Right now I'm in Seljaskóli. I'm working in Móttøkudeild, which is the receiving department of refugee kids, where I teach them Icelandic. In my free time, I do a lot of volunteer work, and this volunteer work actually comes from my young years. I've been doing volunteer work since I was 15, and it's a huge part of my life. It's a huge part of who I am today. So I am born and raised in Denmark, in København. Copenhagen, and my parents are originally from Turkey. So my grandfather, he came to Denmark in the 60s to work, and then he just basically decides to stay. So my dad came when he was 9 years old. So I'm the firstborn Kurdish, Danish in Denmark. Yes, so as I said, I've spent a lot of my young years mentoring and doing volunteer work, working with young people, and especially young people with a different background than Danish. And the goal has totally been to help them navigate the Danish culture, the Danish system, to be a part of the Danish society, because I grew up in a time where we were two groups. It was the Danish kids and then the non-Danish kids. So my goal with all of my friends back then was to try to integrate these two into each other, because it is actually very similar and very easy to live this way as a to integrate and take the Danish culture to your and to become a part of your lifestyle as a Muslim person. Because when we grew up, it was I call us the 9/11 kids. Or the 9/11 Muslim kids, especially, because we were the ones, when it happened, I was 6 years old, and in a very early age, I had to defend my religion. I had to talk about why we were not terrorists, why we actually were good people. I always had to convince people that we were good. So I actually grew up with this convincing instinct to always talk about, okay, I'm actually good people. So I actually smiled. I always smiled some more. Always were more welcoming in my. I didn't feel like I could be a person who could just be sad in the bus or be mad, because I had something I was presenting. I was presenting Islam, and to grow up with this on your shoulders as a child is very heavy. But I did, and when I reflect on it today, I'm thinking, yeah, maybe it happened for a reason, because I am the person I am today. So I see being a Muslim, practicing Muslim, for me is not something that I divide from being integrated into the Icelandic or Danish society, or I call it the Scandinavian now, because I've lived both places. For me, it is actually a lifestyle where, because Islam has a lot of values that are actually also appreciated a lot in the Scandinavian countries. Things like justice, things like the importance of community, things like honesty, truthfulness. All these things are a huge part of Islam, and you are actually not allowed to go out of these. You're not allowed to lie. You're not allowed to be injustice. Actually, one of God's 99 names in Islam is justice. So, and we always try to take these names and be the good person, because we know that God is justice, God is honest, God is merciful. So we try as Muslims to take this upon us and try to be the best version of ourselves also. And when you look at the Scandinavian society and the Scandinavian values, all these things are a huge part. Democracy is a huge part of the society we live in. So as a Muslim, it actually becomes very easy to live here. But then there's the picture that the media gives. That's a whole other story of the things. And for me, I would say that dialogue is one of the keys to break these misconceptions that could be about what one thing actually is. So is Islam actually justice? Because that's not what I see in the medias. So instead of just wondering, the thing I want to talk about today is talking to each other. Talking and communicating, because when you communicate, you start to understand. Because ignorance is something that comes from ignoring each other and not asking the open questions and being open for dialogue, at least. So when I was young, I remember I asked my dad. My dad is a very clever man who always taught me that when I was a kid, I remember once I went, because the Muslims in my class, they didn't want to go to church for Christmas. So I go home and I'm so confused because my dad has always told me that the church is also God's house and we can pray in God's house as Muslims as long as there's no picture in front of us. So we can go in a corner and we can pray. So I go home and I say, Baba, these people, they say we can't go to church for Christmas. And he was like, don't listen to them, you go. So I grew up with a dad like this, which I'm very grateful for, a dad who always tried to show us, who always taught me that, yes, Jesus is a prophet in Islam and we love him as much as all the other prophets, peace be upon them. And always talked about this way of respecting other religions. So I grew up with this, thankfully. So in my teenage years, trying to understand how can I be Muslim in Denmark, how can I try to integrate these things together? It was very difficult because of all these things, all these questions I constantly got. And I remember once, it was in university, where there was a terrorist bombing happening in France, and I was devastated that day, literally devastated, because I thought, okay, first of all, it's going to be put upon Muslims. This crushes me because I do not press on a fly if I see it's underground. So it touches you as someone who believes in this religion, because I know that my prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, would walk around with chains around his ankles so the animals could hear it and walk away so he didn't step on them. So when you believe in a religion like this, it often becomes very difficult to start to try to navigate this hate you get. And someone from my class, he looked at me and he said, are you supporting this terror thing that happened in France? And I just looked at him and I said, are you seriously asking me this question? And I just turned my back because it was actually very heavy to get this question. And so in my young years, it was very difficult, but when you get knowledge, when you learn more about your own religion, when you learn more about other religions, you start to be more confident in what you believe in. And I always say, wherever I go, I say, I'm a proud Muslim, I'm a proud hijabi, someone who wears the hijab, and I'm also a proud Danish person who lives in Iceland, because I see myself as Danish. Right now I live here, but when people ask me, where are you from? I don't say I'm from Turkey. I say I'm from Denmark, because that's where I was born. And I always got the question, so where are you from? Yeah, I'm from Denmark, but where are you actually from? And then I'm like, yeah, okay, my parents they have Kurdish roots. Okay, now we can agree, like, okay. So then people are like, okay, So when you start to get this confidence, you also relax more in your religion, and you actually realize how easy it is to live it in the society you are. Because the Prophet Muhammad, he said that you should you should live Islam according to the society you are in. I understand this hadith, this saying, as, okay, you're not supposed to take the Middle Eastern values and bring them here and say, my wife is not allowed to work, or my wife is not dead, or I am not allowed to do this, or I have to wear this. No, I can wear modest clothes here and still be a part of the society. I can wear my hijab and still people can see me, because I would never allow myself to wear something that is not accepted in the society. But this is my personal experience. This is my personal opinion on this, for example. So in my work life, I pray 5 times a day. In my work life, this doesn't affect me because I just find 5 minutes in my break and I go and pray. And praying in Islam, I don't know if you guys know how it goes, but you can pray in 3 minutes. It's not, it doesn't take long. So in my daily life, it's not difficult for me to be Muslim, and I share my values and my daily life. I told my colleagues that I'm coming here to have this speech today. So when we are open because I've always been someone, people always tell me, Hilal, we can always ask you questions because you're very open for questions. And that's what I try to be, because I know a lot of people don't know much about the lifestyle I have, and therefore I should be open to these questions. And there are some common stereotypes about Islam that we also experience or hear a lot, and one of them is the hijab, where in the Western world this is seen as something that prevents me from being a woman or being a feminist. But I want to talk a little bit about the Western understanding of feminism and then inclusive feminism. Because these two things are something I recently I did a video for Reykjavík a week ago actually, where I was talking about the hijab. And this video is going to be on something called Torkið, where they are, the schools and everyone who works in Reykjavík can open this video up and watch it, and just to get some information. And I read about this inclusive feminism that says, in the Western world, we understand feminism as the woman should be allowed to show her body as much as she wants. She should be allowed to wear whatever she wants. And if she doesn't want to wear anything, she should also be allowed to do that. Where inclusive feminism is, yes, we should be allowed to decide what we want to do with our body as women or men, just as human beings. But I should also be allowed to cover up my body if I want to do that. So, because in the Middle East, it's also a fight when you want to cover up your body in the Middle East. It's not easy. I remember my grandfather was like, why are you wearing this? This is so unnecessary. So it's not because all Muslims are for the hijab and, oh, you get praised and blah, blah, blah. That's not the case with the hijab. It can also be difficult there, but it's a choice. It's a choice you make because you feel spiritually close to God. You feel like a 10, as you were talking about. Okay, my relationship to my God is a 10, 100%. I don't even have to think about saying the number. But then I also want to do something for that number, because I love my God, and God tells me in the Holy Book, He actually talks to the men first. He says, men's hijab, men's modesty is their eyes. And this is actually more difficult because they have to cover their eyes. They have to watch out for what they're looking at. They can't just walk around, look, because they have to be modest. They have to protect what they see with their eyes, where the woman is asked to cover her hair and her chest. And this modesty for me, is a huge gift. I don't see this just as a material. I see this as a part of me who are trying to get closer to God. So this is a spiritual road that I chose to take. And there's also a lot of women who don't want to wear the hijab, but who are very good Muslims also. So the hijab doesn't define you being a Muslim. It's like when you're a Christian and you're supposed to go to church every Sunday, but you choose not to do, for example. This is a choice you make. And the same thing is in Islam. And people often think that Islam you cannot choose, you have to do it. But that's not the case. We're human beings and we can choose what we want to do and what we don't want to do. Which, is a common sense, I would at least hope. And then, so the last thing I just want to say is that it's important that we ask questions, that we talk to each other, that we are curious about each other instead of judging each other, that I can respect, I don't have to agree with you, but I can respect your opinions, the way you're living your life, and the way you're practicing your daily life. Again, this is the thing with tolerance, because tolerance can sometimes be understood as something negative, where I take it and say, okay, I don't have to agree with you, but I respect you and I respect the way you live your life. So let's try to change our views on people, I would say, and be more curious and be more open. And let's not choose ignorance, because it doesn't create any kind of dialogue, and it doesn't create a society that touches each other and that actually gets to share values with each other. There's a priest in Nørrebro in Copenhagen who says that if we can share daily life, we can also share special occasions and just our understanding of who God is to every single person. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Hilal, for giving us this good perspective. Muhammed, welcome. You are the next speaker.
I always feel very comfortable when I take this Icelandic pesa on. So wherever I go, I always have it on me. So sometimes I forget to take it off, especially when you have a small kid. So for all the noises, I would like to apologize.
No, they're beautiful.
Me and my wife, we're literally ping-ponging her, So, but I was very proud of my wife's speech. And very good speech from you as well, Steen. Always good to find people who speak a common language. You feel a little bit home back in Denmark. All right, so thank you so much, Sigurvin, for inviting us for this very positively contributing conference. I think it's very important to conduct dialogue. That is the essence of living together in the society. My name is Muhammed Emin Kizilkaya. I am born in Denmark. I consider myself as Dane, as I grew up with trolls and the ferries and so on. And that was something that my mom would always introduce me when I went to the library. But I have Kurdish roots, like my wife. My grandparents came to Denmark. Actually, my grandfather came to Denmark in 1969. He was only 17 years old. So that's many years ago. So some people consider us as third-generation immigrants. I don't know, maybe my daughter is fourth generation, and the son of or daughter of my daughter is going to be fifth generation. I don't know how long this goes, but we consider ourselves as Danes. We speak Danish at home. I sing Danish lullabies to my daughter when she goes to sleep, and so does my wife. So that's a little bit about myself. I am in my PhD studies right now, and I would like to do it less complicated for you. My main curiosity is really to understand identity formation among young refugees in the Western world. Here we are emphasizing on Iceland. How is it that they are forming their identity? What is the navigation they go through? And it must be very difficult. As you might imagine, at home you're watching Al Jazeera, Arabic television, and speak Arabic, and you have a certain culture and certain religion that you're practicing there, and then you go back in school, and there you have some other values. And so I'm very curious to understand the hybridity, the hybrid formation, hybrid identity that these young people might form, and we have already seen some preliminary findings that actually prove that. The title of my research is called Transcultural Journeys, Unveiling Hybrid Identities and Superdiversity Among Young Quota Refugees in Iceland. And I am a part of a larger research team called ESRCI. We consist of several academics who are commonly emphasizing on critically approaching the social inclusion among young refugees in Iceland. Am I at about that? Yeah, okay. Before we move on, we're going to have a small session together. Something that I made up in the car on the way, so it's not something I've been preparing for long, but I thought it would be a very good idea. What we're going to do now is that we're going to create some imagination in our minds. I want you to imagine that you are walking on Reykjavik streets. It's evening. Are you all imagining? It's evening and you're walking on Reykjavik street. And while you're walking, you see a young man or woman, it's up to your imagination, sitting on a bench by him or herself, looking either straight or looking down on his or her phone. And you wonder, where is this person from? And then you try to create some assumptions. Maybe the person is Arabic. Maybe the person is Muslim. Maybe the person came here alone. Maybe the person is working. Maybe the person is unemployed. Maybe the person has his or her family here. So create that imagination, because we're going to use that and put it in our pocket so we can go further into my research. I will give you 30 seconds to create your own imagination. 30 seconds. Imagine this, and then we'll move on. All right, so I assume that each one of us have created our own kind of picture of that person, our own description of that person. Let's move on. Am I moving on right? Ja, jeg tror det var her. Det er jo fint. Det er den heller ikke. So the aim of my research is, or we can just go directly, or before I actually go into the slide, I will just introduce my research very shortly, and then I'm going to go into the very boring part of the PowerPoint, which is the method. I'm not going to go too much into that, and then I'm going to go into the preliminary findings, and that's when we're going to use our imagination, right? So the aim of my research is to explore how young refugees in Iceland navigate hybridizing identities through cultural, linguistic, and virtual interactions. I'm also trying to examine how cultural heritage and Icelandic norms shape young refugees' belonging, adaptation, and resilience. So adaptation and resilience plays a core element in my research. And furthermore, I'm trying to analyze how interactions in social, cultural, and digital spaces influence refugee youth's sense of identity and emotional well-being. So this is my core area of my research, really to try to understand how are they adapting to the Icelandic society. There are very limited research on the adaptation processes and identity navigation that these young people are exploring. By doing that, by critically approaching these aspects, we also provide some guidelines for institutions in Iceland of how to see and look and understand these young people. So the context is following. I'm trying to understand how they're navigating hybridizing identities. So as you might imagine, it can be very difficult for a young refugee to navigate yourself in the Icelandic society or in any societies. And this is not a matter of being a refugee. This is a matter of being an immigrant. So wherever you go in the world, the matter of immigration is always complex. So young people, they have a certain lifestyle, a certain culture at home. They have some expectations. And when they travel from home to school, then they approach other expectations. So the parents might have some expectations on these young people, that you have to be this and that. But when they go into school, the teachers might have some other expectations. So as you might see, it is extremely complex for young people who came to a new country, who speak several languages and has to learn a new language. You can imagine how difficult it is to navigate. And that's why we also have problems, because some of those youngsters, they end up in situations where they cannot find solution. So they decide to choose extreme lifestyle. So when you cannot form this hybrid identity, if you don't know how to navigate yourself in a multi-layered society, then there's a tendency of choosing extreme. That is either by joining gangs or extreme radical Muslim groups. I don't see difference between them. We are both devoted into religion. I don't see difference between gangs and extreme radical groups. They're the same kind of extremism that they're promoted. So I implement the concept of super diversity, and that is a concept that was presented by Stephen Vesovich in 2007. And Vesovich argues that diversity is beyond diversity. We live in a society where it's not only about ethnicity and race and nation, it's more than that. It is values, it's equality, it's social classes. And for me to understand the living and the navigation of identities among young people, I'm trying to implement super diversity as an analytical tool to understand the different kind of exposure that they are going through. So, and then I'm actually presenting a new concept that is called hyperdiversity. It is very controversial, I would say, because it tends to oppose the concept of super diversity. Hyperdiversity says, well, diversity is intensifying. When you are going into the social media, you can go from A to Z in a split second. The social media presents hyperdiversity. It is hyper. It's constantly intensified in diversity, in transculturalism, etc. So hyperdiversity, superdiversity are my analytical tools in my research. And I'm using language portraits, which is an anatomy of a body where youngsters are drawing where they feel on the part of the body, which language they feel that on the different part of the bodies. And then I'm also using value card activities, which I'm going to talk a little bit further on later on. So superdiversity explains the complexity of migration-driven diversity, while hyperdiversity helps us to understand intensified diversity within the virtual world. In my research proposal, I am explaining that these youngsters, young refugees, they are belonging to the Gen Z, the Generation Z, that are the generation grew up with the social media. So if we as researchers want to understand young people within the age of, which is my target, the age of 13 to 22, we have to imply the social media. We cannot get a full conceptualize the living of young refugees without including the virtual world. And furthermore, hybridity or hybrid identity was firstly presented by Baba in 1994, and that is that people who are identities is fluid, and young people or people who are navigating through multi-layered cultures, they tend to develop this hybrid identity, knowing how to act, knowing which identity that you're pulling out in different social settings. And then transculturality, it's actually a very easy concept to understand. It says, it was presented by Welsh in 1999, cultures overlap and blend. They are not fixed, but they're fluid. For example, when we go in Laugavíkur and you go to a shop or a restaurant, let's say you want to eat sushi, then you go from the Icelandic context, and as soon you enter this restaurant, it becomes, you get a sense of Japan. You know, the decorations, the cultural paintings, and so on. If it's a very traditional restaurant, this is what Welsh argues as being transcultural, that cultures are constantly overlapping. It is not something that we can prevent. It has happened throughout history, and it will happen even more and even more intensifying with the globalized tendencies that we are currently experiencing. And then multidimensional belonging, Johansson and Porølia, it's a Scandinavian study. They argue that belonging is emotionally experienced. It is shaped by relationships, social settings, and personal meaning, and exists across both social and digital spaces. In our preliminary findings, we've seen that youngsters have multiple belongings. They feel like they belong in Iraq because they have the social media, but at the same time, they belong here. So belonging is not something that necessarily comes out from physical belonging, but it is an emotion, it's a feeling of something, that you belong to something. And that's extremely important to use when we want to understand the complex lives that young refugees are undergoing. I hope I'm not too boring, am I? I'm going to go very short into the methodology. We are using a mixed qualitative method. We have been traveling in 11 different municipalities, Ísafjörður up in the north, east, not east actually, it's one of the few areas we haven't traveled, but north, west, and south of Iceland. We so far have conducted 120 interviews. It is a very big research that has been funded by Rannis. We are 3 PhD students, 1 postdoc, and several professors, run by Hanna Ragnarsdóttir, which you might know about. And we are emphasizing on youngsters aged 13 to 22 who came to Iceland after 2018, so we can get a glimpse on the first socialization processes that they are undergoing of all genders. So it's from after 15, from 15 to 19, families were resettled via the UN resettlement program from 2015 and 19. So we are emphasizing on quota refugees. And what we have found in our preliminary findings, which is very interesting, and we just recently started, so there's a lot of data that we're still working on. We found out that hybrid identities develop as youth balance cultural heritage and Icelandic norms. So they learn to adapt Icelandic norms, but they also learn to adapt their Arabic norms. So they know how to be in school, in Icelandic schools, and they also know how to, the different social settings that they have at home. That's also something that me and my wife have. We speak 5-6 languages, and we've also have this, we know exactly how to act in different social settings. We also came to the conclusion in our preliminary findings that social media fosters cultural connections and transcultural communication, both with friends and families across border. And then we have something about online gaming, which plays a huge role among young people because they tend to engage in multilingual interactions. So young refugees speak English on gaming, they speak Icelandic, and they also use Arabic and so on. They are literally juggling with many languages at the same time. And this is very interesting. But tradition and adaptation vary. Some families embrace new customs. So we have had some families from Syria who said that, well, in our house we are celebrating 2 celebrations. We celebrate Christmas and we celebrate Eid. Do we know what Eid is? Which is very interesting, and these families are devoted Muslims, but it is a tradition. It is a way of maintaining cultural practices while adapting to the new cultural practices that they have in Iceland. So these are, of course, very positive outcome that we have seen. However, what we have as a huge issue right now are the schools. We have lack of guidelines. We've seen it also, and today, and what's happening, unfortunately, in certain area of Reykjavik, there are lack of guidelines. We don't know how to approach the teachers of those, the parents of those young people. We don't know how to approach the youngsters. We don't have any guidelines. So we have seen that school adaptation is a challenge. There's language barrier. There are lot of reliance on mediators for communication between parents and teachers. So this is why we come out with this research. We want to critically approach the topic of inclusion. Each of us have different approaches. We have 3 different PhD students working on it. Mine is merely on social networking and identity formation. And by conducting this research, we hope to create these guidelines. Lastly, religious and cultural misconceptions often place youth in position where they must explain or justify their beliefs and customs to Icelandic peers. Hilal has explained it very clearly. I've also had it, and there's always this constantly of having to explain about yourself. Well, we were on a radio in Bylgjan yesterday, and we're talking about dialogue, and the news anchor, he asked me, well, you're talking about dialogue, but what's happening in Iran? And I'm like, first of all, I'm not Persian. I've never lived in Iran in my life before. Last time I went to Turkey was 2016. That's roughly 8 years ago. Yeah, but can you explain about Iran? Why am I going to explain about Iran? We came here to talk about dialogue. Yeah, but people want to know about it. Yes, sure. But you're asking the wrong person. Maybe you should go and find some books about, the politics in Iran. And by the way, politics and religion doesn't mix well. That's the one I want to say. So that's actually what I said as an answer. I said, politics and religion, they don't mix well. Because it becomes, you use religion as an egocentralized way of promoting your own beliefs and thoughts, or justifying your own beliefs and thoughts. And then I said, right now we're focusing on dialogue in Iceland, not in Iran. I am not in Iran right now. So that's what we have. They always or often have to justify their beliefs, which create segregation, unfortunately. So I already went through these aspects of implication discussion. This is one of the language portrayings that we have been doing. We are asking the youngsters to draw where they feel like the part of the body, which language they feel that belongs to the body. This is an elder young person who put Arabic here around the middle section of the body. Icelandic is here because you have to think with Icelandic. And then legs. Danish is down the leg. It's so unnecessary with Danish that they put them down to the legs. And French, that's something we don't use that much, so it's down here. But we have this switch between Arabic either be around the chest area or around the head. Our preliminary findings show so far that those who grew up here, who came here at 6 years old, they tend to put Icelandic here. And Arabic is somewhere here on the hands or on the leg. Whereas those who came as older teenagers, they still have Arabic here around the heart. So if I would be drawing this, I would not put Kurdish here personally. I'm put Danish here. I am Dane, even though I have dark beard and very hairy arms and dark hair. I am identity-based. I'm Dane. So time is running out. Dialogue is extremely important. We are working on dialogue. I am not much for providing academic presentations. I like to provide more kind of like dialogue-based presentation, but I understood that this was a very important aspect that the host wanted me to explain, so there you have it. But I want to end up saying we should work, and we have a lot of work to do. We see segregation happening. We see hate blooming up because of misconception. I don't believe in hate. I don't. I simply don't believe in hate. I think hate is lack of knowledge. So when you were imagining that young person, did you imagine that the person went through all this process? Or did you have a simplistic imagination compared to what I just presented? From that, we have to question ourselves, how much do we know about young people or immigrants or Muslims? One of my good friends, Steen, he is a very devoted Christian, and we talk about religion. He talks about Jesus, and I love talking about Jesus because Jesus plays a huge role in Islam too. We have to learn we don't have to agree, and not agreeing is not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because then we can learn from each other. But we have to look and understand the point of each one of us have from a positive aspect. We can disagree, but we can talk. That's the most important thing. That's how dialogue works. So we in Fellow Horizon, there's 2 other members here. We've been working hardly since 2014, and interestingly, media never talks about us because media like to talk about the bad things that's happening. We established Pangia Stærðfræðikeppni, which is the largest math competition in Icelandic history. It is refugees and young Muslims who established that here in Iceland. And we tried to get some PR from the Icelandic media, but they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about the Ranis budget that we have gotten, working on Scandinavian identity among young people here. So that's why I'm so thankful to know Pastor Sigurðin Lárus Jónsson for the contribution that he's doing. It's so important. I'm so happy being here. I'm so proud of having my wife here as well, and we are both babysitting and talking, attending a conference. So if you want to change the world, what does Michael Jackson say, even though that I'm not a fan of him, I don't like him that much, to be honest, but he says something very beautifully. Look at the man in the mirror. So if you want to change the world, we have to change the world from our aspect, because it is like COVID-19. When we change, when we smile, it's going to spread. That's how Jesus taught us, Abraham taught us, Muhammed taught us, Solomon taught us, Adam taught us, Moses taught us, Noah taught us. It was all about kindness. So thank you so much. Thank you, Sigurðin, for inviting both me and my wife here. And thank you all for coming. And I'm just going to end up here. I hope I haven't surpassed the time too much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Muhammed. Now I would like to welcome Heiðrún, Reverend from Borgarnes. She is going to tell us about her experience both in Copenhagen and here in Iceland with refugees.
Firstly, I want to thank the valuable voices that we've heard here in Vídalínskirkju today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. My name is Heiðrún Helga, and I'm a pastor in Borgarnes Church. I've only been in that field of work for a few years, though. I used to work with young refugees in Copenhagen. I have a master's degree in sociology of religion, and the aim of my final thesis was to find out how young refugees develop their identity in a new cultural setting. Muhammed, we have to talk later. When my research period ended, I dedicated my career to working with those young people, a group that still today takes up a big part of my heart. While working with them, I remember that I promised myself that one day I would share their voices, that I would tell their stories, do whatever it takes to guard their rights in our society so they can get the same opportunities as other people their age. Then I moved to Iceland, started working in the church, and the thought sometimes hit me that I was not fulfilling my promise. But still, when Sigurðin asked me to speak here today, my first thought was, that is not my microphone to hold. Who am I to talk about refugees in Iceland when I should be the one listening, educating myself? Is my research even relevant years later and in a completely different setting? And then I remembered that often when I ask people to talk in my church in Borgarnes, they reply, "Me? But I never go to church. I don't even believe in God." Which to I always reply, that may well be, but your voice needs to be heard. So even though I was hesitant to come onto this stage today, I'm going to say to myself that my voice, their voices through my voice, need to be heard. So thank you once again for having me. The title of my thesis was De smukke unge mennesker, a study of identity formation among young people with different ethnic backgrounds. I did empirical research in a school for people aged 15 to 25 that had recently arrived in Denmark as refugees, most of them on their own. I did interviews and field observations over a period of 6 months. The purpose was to take a look at the way in which the students develop their identity through education and socialization. As the empirical data could not stand alone, I used theories within the field of sociology in order to come to a conclusion. I'm not going to bore you to death with theories on identity, but as the French scholar Pierre Bourdieu said, theory without empirical research is empty. Empirical research without theory is blind. So I'm going to give you a short introduction on the theories that I used for my research. I used theories regarding identity formation in multinational societies provided by 3 British scholars, Anthony Giddens, Richard Jenkins, and Stuart Hall. Their theories state that our identity is in constant process, constantly developing and redeveloping. And if we think about our lives, who we were, who we are, and who we want to be, this makes perfect sense. Hopefully we all get to develop and then redevelop who we are and how we view the world around us. According to Anthony Giddens, our identity is constantly being added to and built on. He used the term self-biography in this context and states that our identity is built on what we think we are now, according to our past and present circumstances, together with what we would like to become, our hopes and dreams for the future. Back in the day, people were born into certain roles in society, often not very flexible roles, but today we are constantly exposed to different global influences, and therefore each person needs to construct and constantly reconstruct some sort of a self. This becomes very prominent when we move to a new country, when we are taken out of the social context we are born into and know, and therefore have to build up a completely new image of who we are. That can be challenging, especially to begin with, when the unwritten rules of society are still a mystery to us. When we realize that the knowledge and skills that have defined us all our lives are of little or no value in the new social setting, that creates a rift in our self-biography. It is a fact that immigrants are put into a certain social category, according to language skills, looks, religion, etc. They often have fewer opportunities regarding jobs, education, and even housing. But through my research, I noticed, however, that many of my informants saw their new social setting in a very positive way. The opportunities in Denmark as being endless and the freedom unlimited. They did not compare themselves with Danish people or even other foreigners. Their main focus was on learning the language and to build a life in a new country. Keep the narrative and the self-biography flowing. That underlines what Giddens stated, that we feel like it is up to us to create and recreate the social self. Richard Jenkins agrees with Giddens that social identity is not something that is fixed, but constantly being developed and redeveloped. The difference is, however, that our interaction with others matters the most while developing our social self. According to his theories, identity is something we create in relation to other people. He puts emphasis on our interaction with others while we develop our personal self. And here, things start to get interesting. Through my research, it was very clear that my informants were very happy about being in Denmark, many of them fleeing horrible situations in their home countries. In general, they were thankful that the Danish social system assisted with housing, education, and what they needed to start a new life in safety. But when new students arrived at the school, it was heartbreaking to hear the students who had lived in Denmark for a longer time giving advice to the newcomers. Never go around in large groups, always give way on the sidewalk, smile if someone looks at you, keep your voice down, be extra polite, never run on the streets, not even when you're missing the bus, otherwise the cops will arrive. I'm not criticizing the Danish cops, I'm just sharing their experience of having brown skin in the streets of Copenhagen, their experience of safety. I take my safety for granted, but my informants felt they had to earn their safety, created by following a complicated set of rules. And how do we develop our social identity in relation to others if this relation to others is complicated and even unsafe? It is a common misunderstanding that people don't get harassed in our streets for looking different from the majority. I once stood next to my friend at a bus stop in Copenhagen. She is Danish. She wears a hijab. An old woman came to the bus stop, rolled her eyes and blurted out, "Isn't it incredible? There is not a single Danish person left in this city." She wasn't talking about me, the foreigner. She was talking about my friend, the Danish person. How does it affect our social identity if we can't even wait for the bus in safety? Earlier I called it a misunderstanding, but maybe racism is just something that we refuse to face. Rupi Kaur wrote a poem that says, "No one on this planet is in more denial than the white man, who, regardless of all the evidence in front of him, still thinks racism and sexism and all the world's pain don't exist." And I warn you to look her up, this dangerous poet, because her books are banned from more educational institutions in America. I have a friend that lives in Copenhagen. She often experiences people yelling at her on the streets for being Muslim, that she should get back home, that she doesn't belong. One day she was so tired of it that she turned around and yelled back, "I'm not even Muslim, I'm from Brazil." And the man, he apologized. This is such ridiculous behavior in the first place, and it gets even more ridiculous. "Oh, I'm sorry, love, I didn't know you were from Brazil." What kind of world is this man living in, thinking he can humiliate a woman from one cultural background, but is truly sorry when he finds out that she is from another? How does it affect our social identity if we can't even walk down the street without being treated with such disrespect? We have to start calling people out on behavior like this. Stuart Hall stated that our identities change in relation to the cultural systems and contexts that surround us. This means that our self is continuously developing in relation to social norms, media representation, and interaction with other people. Values and cultural narratives can therefore impact how we are seen by others and how we see ourselves. Therefore, as cultural systems change due to social movements or shift in public discourse, so can our identities. According to Hall, we put ourselves into certain cultural categories and identify us with the meanings and values given to them. Through my research, I found out that that was exactly what my informants did. They are categorized by outer society as foreigners, and that is what forms their identity in a new country. But that doesn't have to be negative at all. In the school I did my research, the emphasis was always on how proud the students should be of their roots, how lucky they were to have this huge international network in Denmark. Them being different was praised and lifted. They were told to be proud of their different backgrounds, experiences, and skills. As they learned the language, learned about the Danish culture and society, they slowly but steadily gained enough self-esteem to go out in society, and from the school's side, they were constantly told that they had every opportunity to become valuable Danish citizens, and that Denmark was lucky to have so many beautiful young people to make their country richer. Therefore, the school song was De smukke unge mennesker. The school was their safe place, a place they could express themselves and ask questions, develop a full social identity in relation to people that had similar experience and people that truly supported their journey. Out in society, reality was different. I had the feeling then, and now I know, because luckily, young Danish people are now sharing with us their experience of having more than one cultural background, and we need to listen. This is Basim, a Danish sweetheart that took part in the Danish X Factor in the year 2008, only 15 years old at the time. He later won the Danish Eurovision Song Contest. People absolutely loved him, and they still do. He is Danish. He is of Moroccan origin. Lately, he has been opening up about his roots and admitting that through his whole childhood, he was nervous what consequences it would have if he spoke too much about his background. And I quote, "Will they think I'm strange if I tell them that I am a Muslim?" I wonder what it does to our social identity when we are born and raised in a country that doesn't welcome, let alone praise and lift up our different backgrounds, experiences, cultures, and languages. My informants often told me that when they spoke their mother language on the bus or on the train, people would yell at them, tell them to speak Danish. Where does all this anger come from? What are we so afraid of? Basim states, "I always felt that I had to be the extra nice one. As a child, I quickly learned that if I smiled a little extra, was extra polite, spoke nicely, then I could maybe avoid being put into a box. If I did a little better, people would see me as an individual and not just one from a group they already had an opinion about." Does this ring a bell? Exactly what my informants said to each other when giving good advice on living in Denmark. Imagine having to do this in your own country. What a complicated and exhausted set of rules to live by. And Basim continues, "I know the looks, the comments, the hidden prejudice. I know how the media has drawn a picture of Muslims as something else, something foreign, something that doesn't really fit in. The media is powerful, and it holds great responsibility. Stereotyping, like Basim refers to, is not only unfortunate, it is dangerous. It is dehumanizing. Because when we say the Muslims are like this, the Muslims are like that, we are referring to so many different people. And by putting a large group of people in a tiny box, we are robbing them of their humanity. Because by doing that, we can't hear their opinions, hopes, and dreams, things they like and dislike. We can't see their joys and daily lives, and we never get the picture of a whole person. Let me tell you how those Muslims are words you are never going to hear from people who actually have Muslims in their lives. It is hard for most of us to imagine, but I want you to try. Imagine moving to a new country and being referred to as the Christian. Imagine being born and raised in a country and being referred to as the Christian. I'm a pastor, and I wouldn't even like to be categorized like that, because I am so much more than my religion. Here is a picture of Christians, Icelandic Christians. Quite a narrow description of who we are, right? Maybe you are wondering why I'm taking all these examples from Denmark when we are here in Iceland. And I can tell you why. Because it is hard to face the truths about our own society. It is often as if we can't see things clearly when they are right in front of our eyes. It makes it somewhat easier for us to face the situation in other countries, because then a tiny voice behind our ear can whisper, "It's not like that here. It's not like that here in Iceland." But it is. We should not think for 1 second that it is any different in Iceland. This is an article from Moggin, an Icelandic newspaper. The headline, "The boys roam the streets in flocks." The journalist names the neighborhood and states that the situation is hard because 5 12-year-old boys repeatedly show violent behavior towards other students. Part of the group is said to be from the Middle East. We read a bit further. 4 out of 5 boys are foreign. We read a bit further. At least 2 of them are from the Middle East. or Arabic speaking. We read further, even though we really don't want to, but it gets worse. It is hard to get the parents into dialogue with the school. It says the men have no respect for women. It says the women are not allowed to represent their homes. It says this view passed on to the boys that do not respect women, it says. And I underline the fact that this is not from a comment section on social media, but from a newspaper that people read and subscribe to. It is harmful to write words like this in a newspaper because it affects a lot of people in a very negative way. And how does it affect our identity formation to read headlines and articles like this? How does it affect your daily life if you are a 12-year-old boy that fits this description in the neighborhood mentioned or in other neighborhoods? Hopefully they are not reading the newspaper at all, but I think I would smile a little wider too. Be extra polite. Be careful to make sure the people around me see that I am not at all violent. We are talking about 12-year-old children here. I guess I too would think twice before roaming around in a flock, which is, by the way, what boys this age do. The headline sounds like there are hundreds of them, roaming around like wild animals. But the boys mentioned in the article are 5 in total. 2 of them are from the Middle East. Maybe. Do you see what is happening here? How does it affect us if we are fathers living in the neighborhood mentioned, loving fathers that respect our wives and want nothing but to live a peaceful life in a country that is supposed to be safe? How would it affect my social identity, I wonder, if people assume that the clothes I am wearing were a tool of oppression, that I am not allowed to represent my home in a social setting? And what does that even mean? I will never know. And that is why I have to listen. Listen carefully when people share their experience of belonging to a group the media often talks about, but seldom talks to. While I was working on this speech, I saw this on my Facebook feed. A young woman shares her article, the headline, "As a Black woman in Denmark, I never know when I become the other." The comment section had to be shut down because of the amount of hateful comments directed against her. Is it a dangerous message she's delivering? Is it radical? She's only sharing her experience. And this is what scares me. We have access to so much information, but still we seem to live in times when we have very little interest in each other. Like we are not at all curious about different views and experiences. At least it seems like a certain group of people is not worthy of a voice, not worthy of sharing their opinion and experience. They can be here, but they better lower their voices. And I worry how this tendency affects our young people that are now forming their social identities. If I was a 12-year-old girl with brown skin reading this comment section, I definitely wouldn't dare to share my thoughts and experiences. Or a 42-year-old pastor, for that sake. How can we turn this development around? I guess we just have to listen, stand strong, and refuse to let hate and anger win over love. Sambu is another Danish singer, also of Moroccan origin, born and raised in Denmark. His musical career dates back to his teenage years, and he has not been afraid to use his voice to express his experience of combining 2 cultures. His song, Ramadan in Copenhagen, being a beautiful example on how 2 cultures can easily thrive together. He teaches us that we should celebrate diversity instead of being afraid. And what are we so afraid of? He states, "I would rather die for love than live with hate." Amen to that. We live in times of outrage and fear, and that is not a good cocktail. A lot of people are afraid to speak their minds, people with voices that we need to hear. That is why this conversation we are having here today is so important. And we have to ask ourselves when we leave from here today, what kind of a society do I want to live in? What kind of a society do I want to pass on to my children? A society of love, understanding, and respect, which could be the title of this beautiful photo of my friend, my Muslim friend, lighting a candle in a church in Copenhagen. Or do we want a society full of fear, suspicion, and mistrust? A society where brown boys are hesitant to walk around in groups. A society where hateful words are yelled at people on the streets. A society where hundreds of hateful comments on social media are directed against innocent people that speak their minds or simply choose to take stand with love and basic human rights. That is our reality now, and we need to turn the development around. Together. Luckily, it's easy, because a lot of us want a society where diversity and understanding gets to rule. There are so many of us that want to make a change. And doing that is simple. We simply need to listen, then speak up, show those around us with words and behavior that we insist on letting go of fear. We can choose to live in fear, but the opposite of fear is knowledge and understanding. And how do we gain understanding? We get curious. We allow ourselves to get closer to each other. And I guess that is the main theme here. We need to get connected. And we do that simply by getting closer to the people around us. We can do it insecurely. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to show up authentically. That is all it takes. We too often hear about people who work hard, follow the rules of society, want nothing but an opportunity to build a life in safety. But still they don't get the permission to stay in our country, a country that has plenty of food, plenty of space, plenty of opportunities, and it breaks our heart every time. But pay attention to the fact that society around those people, the people in the children's school and kindergartens, the sport clubs, the neighbors, those are the ones who act on it and assist in every possible way. When we know people, we stand up for them when we notice them being done wrong. So our homework from today is simply to think, how am I going to get to know the people in my closest community? Sometimes a little curiosity is all we need to respond with kindness instead of anger. Often all we need to do is start a conversation. Listening to people is the easiest way to show them that they matter. Thank you for your time.
Thanks to everyone who came here today to speak, and thank you all who came and listened, and also you who have been with us through the screen.